All right. Good, I'm off mute. Hello and welcome back to day 3 of Alpha DevCon. I'm excited to have everyone back here today. I'm joined this morning by Greg Bowling, our VP of Sales, who is going to be going over our third and final analytics session for DevCon. Today, Greg will be talking about building out dashboards and doing analytics using Alpha Transform. Hello, Greg, are you there? I see you on camera. And
yep, here I am.
And I can hear you as well. Fantastic.
Excellent.
So there's been an awful lot of new stuff that's been done in Transform when it comes to analytics, and so I won't keep you because I have a feeling this next 59 minutes is going to be jam-packed. Yeah. I'll let you go right to it. Thanks.
All right, sounds good.
I can go ahead and make you the presenter. And
yeah, make me the presenter.
Box.
All right. Show that one. I'll turn the camera off so you guys can see.
All right.
And let's go. All right. So as David introduced, this session is really a more hands-on, practical designing dashboards using the new Transform Analytics. So our agenda today is pretty simple. We're actually just going to implement a dashboard example, and we're going to follow the sort of planning and design practices that we talked about in the first session. So I thought this would be useful to kind of put this into context and take a somewhat made up scenario, but that has some things we can go through and turn it into an actual working dashboard. So with that being said, the scenario that we're going to work with here is just a manufacturing company, and they're looking for production quality insights on their factory. So they have an operations manager and who's in charge of overall quality, and they want to obviously minimize defects because those have real cost concerns for them. So this company has 3 shifts, 4 different manufacturing lines, and any of those lines can make a number of different products. And then as a process, they have a production result process where a shift supervisor or someone enters in production every hour into the manufacturing line. So how many did they make? How many defects were there? How did they resolve the defects and things like that? So that's kind of our overall scenario that we're trying to build a dashboard around. So as we talked about in the first session, we need to do a little bit of preparation before we dive in and start building a dashboard, right? So we talked about, what are our key metrics, right? Our KPIs. So in this case, and this would come from talking to the operations manager and the people that are going to consume the dashboard, overall defect rate for the day is their number one concern, right? And that's a simple, how many defects were there divided by the number of things that they tried to make. And then they would also like to see defect rates by shift and by maybe item they're producing. They're interested in the resolution of those defects. They have 3 different categories. So an item can come off the line that has a defect, but it's not so bad that they can't use it. So they have a use as is, or maybe it's something that they can correct and then use again. And then there's just scrapped. It's just, totally beyond help. Obviously, scrapped is the worst kind of resolution. It meant we put a bunch of materials through the line, took a bunch of time, and we ended up having to throw something in a bin that's probably going to go to a recycler or something like that, right? And there's a lesson learned about turning off your
do not disturb setting, yeah.
Yes. All right. Where were we? Okay. So, in fact, let me do that right now just to make sure. Okay, all right. We'd like to know the number of defects by manufacturing line, and we'd like to know production volumes. So, just overall how many things we made and maybe by manufacturing. So, next slide, here we go. Okay, so we also want to be concerned with how are we getting this information that we need in order to do those metrics. In this case, there's a transform form that they are using where they filled out this form off to the right every hour. Here's what we made. Here's which shift was it, which manufacturing line, which item was it, how many did we make, how many were defects, and what are the 3 categories. A real basic form, that they use to collect the data. So the one thing that we notice in this form is that the defect rate is not calculated by the form. It could have been, right? We could have some TPL in here that calculates that for me and makes it a piece of data, but in this case it isn't, and I might have hundreds of forms already in the system that people have submitted without that. So that's something we'll have to deal with. So as we think about designing our dashboard, the most important thing we know today's defect rate, right? And then in talking, we learned that shift and production defect rates are pretty important. The defect stats over time is a little less important, and really the production stats is just kind of background information that we would like to know as we're kind of looking at this. So we'd like to highlight a couple of pieces of really critical information. If our defect rate is out of bounds, so it's too high, then we want to make that highlighted. And the number of defects that result in scrap is actually an important key as well. So that is that. So the next thing that we are going to do is maybe sketch out our dashboard a little bit. So here's a real rough sketch of what we think the dashboard should look like. So we've got our defect rate in the upper left-hand corner because it's the most important. It's 2%. Maybe that means it's green, or some other way of saying, hey, this is okay. We have our shift and our item breakdowns of defects. Maybe that's a bar or something. We want to look at, here's our defects by resolution. Maybe some kind of bar like that over time. Maybe we do the same thing for the defects by manufacturing line. Our production could be a line, and then our production by manufacturing line could be, maybe a stacked series of lines. So now we're going to dive into actually trying to implement this dashboard, which will look something like what we've got up on the screen here. So fortunately, for the sake of time, Dan actually did a really good job of covering kind of some of the basics that we need to understand about transform analytics. So our data source is transform forms that people have submitted. So that's our source of data. That those forms have metadata like status and created date, and they have form data, which is the things we had on the actual form. We're going to have a dashboard as a collection of tiles. We can have a bunch of dashboards. We're only going to create one right here. And obviously, tiles are a chart or a template of the view of the data. And one other thing that is important to understand, I think, as we go through this, and I thought Dan had a really good picture of this as well, but just kind of how our form data gets turned into a chart. So we start with a list of forms, and maybe those are filtered at the dashboard or the tile level. Then we choose some kind of processing type that says, okay, how am I going to create chart data? Could just be counting all the X values, or we do some kind of math, add up everything, or it could be some kind of continuous line, or we can do it in TPL. Then we pick sources for our X, Y, and our group data. There's tons and tons of options there. We'll go through a few of them. That data gets processed into chart data, and then we have some ability to modify that before it renders into a chart. So that's kind of just how things work. I think that'll help us as we go through these. So the next thing we're going to do is just set up our dashboard, right? So we're going to start from a new dashboard, and what we want to do, and I'm just going to jump over now to transform. So make this a little bigger, just so we can kind of see it. So I'm going to create a new dashboard here. And then I'm going to give it a name. Like that. And then the first thing that we want to do is we want to set up a filter. So if I save the properties here, you'll see that the default dashboard comes with a tile that just counts the number of forms that I have in Transform, right? So I have 402 forms that have been created in my account. So what I want to do is I want to filter that down to just the data that I want to work with. And in that case, so I add a new filter rule. I'm actually going to look at the form ID. I'm going to choose from a list. I'm going to choose this production form that we have, production entry form, production report, right? So that's actually going to be all of the, just the production form. So if I save that and it reloads, you'll see there's 252 production reports in there. So now, and then I'll go ahead and save my dashboard just in case I lose internet or something. So, you know, as I think about my sort of my sketch of what I wanted to see the defect rate here, maybe by shift and item. And I'm kind of looking at, you know, maybe my resolutions and my line defects, and then my production down here. You know, so, you know, as I kind of plan it out, how we're going to approach this today, and I'll jump back over to this slide here. We're going to actually start with sort of the simplest charts, and we're going to work our way up to some more complex things as a demonstration purpose. So each tile we do is going to have a new feature or something. That's probably not how you would go about it, you know, as you're doing your dashboard design. You're probably going to work on maybe the most important tile and work our way down, right? So, but in this case, we'll kind of do them in a little bit of a different order. So I am going to leave that default tile up here for now because I'm going to reuse it toward the end. But I'm going to start with production volume, right? So this is just going to tell us like how much have we produced. So I'm just going to go in and add a new tile. I'm going to choose a blank chart, right? And for production, I think we'll make it maybe medium large just for fun. What did I say here? So on this one, maybe we want like a line chart, or I like the stacked area because it kind of shades in under the line. It makes it a little easier to see. So for our processing type, we're actually going to process how many we've produced, right? So we want to take all the forms for that period, process it together, add them all up and say, okay, I made this many things. We're going to get our data from fields on the form, right? And then for our X data, we're actually going to, and here I can choose my production form so that I can get some of the form data. So I'm going to choose a field from my production form, and I actually want on my form, they submit like what time is it that you know they're doing. So you can see right now there's 250 forms in the system. That's not really a very useful graph. So we're going to use this clustering, and for this case, we're just going to cluster it by the date. So that will make one row for each day that I have a submission. And then there's another option here that I like for this is we'll display a compact label, which gets rid of the year because we don't really need it. So we're already, partway on our chart here. For our Y value, we're actually just looking at, we go back here, the quantity produced, which is a field in our form, right? So our form, we're going to just choose from the field list. We'll go down here and find from our form fields, quantity produced. And now we have a nice little chart that tells us our production for the forever, really. But so the other thing that we'll probably want to do, go down here and give this a title. This is production by day. I don't think we need a label on the axes. I think it makes sense to us. These are dates, these are amounts, so that's good. And then if we save that, we have a production tile. One thing I am going to do for later is change the color of that to a color scheme that we've kind of come up with for production. And this is just for later. So it's a green, more a green scheme for that. So that's, our first, real basic tile. It took us all of like 2 minutes to put together. So the next thing we're going to go to is actually our defects by manufacturing line. So this is going to use a grouping feature. Everything else is going to be mostly the same. So in this case, we're going to create a new tile. Oops, create a new tile. Another blank chart. I'm going to make this medium large. This one I want to use a stacked bar chart because we're going to add up some things here, add up our defects by line into a tall column, right? So same thing here, our X is going to be from our production form, we're going to get our date. And we're going to cluster that by day again, so we put it all together. And I like my compact labels. In this case, our Y is the defect, number of defects, the total. That's also a field in our form, right? So if we go down, we can see the quantity of defects here. So I can see right now, these are the total number of defects that I have per day. But what I want to see is that broken out by the manufacturing line. So I can go to my group data and add that. And what I'm going to choose for my group data is the manufacturing line, and that is going to create a stack for each manufacturing line. Now we need some labels and things so we know what this is. So, this is and we would like to show also a legend for my groups, put that at the bottom. So my manufacturing lines are 101 to 104. And then, if I save this, one of the things we talked about is using a good set of color schemes, right? So the out of the box one is going to give you a very contrasting, blue, red, green, yellow cycle. For my purposes, I think this makes it a little bit difficult to see what's going on. So we're actually, what I like to do is go out and try to pick a sort of a common color scheme for everything. So the green came, from a palette. I've got some tools out there that I've used. Adobe has a color thing. Sarah actually made me a real nice color palette picker that she calls What a Palette that I've used that actually lets you say, oh, let's, and this is just a library we found. So if I wanted a set of blues or something like that. So I'm sure Sarah can do a webinar or something on that, how that's put together. So what I've then come up with is a nice blue color scheme for, sort of a monochrome that I can go into my tile, drop my colors in here, and it's a little bit easier to kind of read at this point. Now, one thing, as I start to look at this, it's like, okay, this is the order we're doing it in, but this is my least important graph, of everything that we talked about. So I can do things like rearrange you know, my tiles a little bit, so I could move this one back and sort of keep it in the order that I want. But so this is how you can use grouping. We could also change it. I like the stack bar for something like that because I'm looking at how many total defects and then how they're broken out by manufacturing line. You can use it like a bar chart. Just a plain bar will then create them side by side. If you are comparing things, you don't care about the total. But I like that this kind of shows me the total as well as the breakdown. So the next thing we want to look at is, you know, we want to look at defect resolution, production by manufacturing line, sorry. So this is really just the same chart when it all comes down to it. So we can actually just duplicate this tile and go here and change a couple things. So, you know, the Y for our here instead of defects is actually just the production, right? And then since we're talking about production, I want to be consistent with my other, you know, tile that's a stacked line graph. So I think I'll change it to match, right? And that gives me, you know, a chart that looks like this. And then sort of the last thing for consistency's sake, as we talk about, this is really production and not a defect chart. So I want to use my green color scheme instead of my blue one. So my green is going to represent production. Blue is going to be more defect, blue and gray. So now I have a tile that kind of matches. Maybe I want to make these the same size. Make it not as, whoops. Make it shorter. You know, maybe I want to show it the other way around. All right, so there's some kind of, you know, consistency here. Oh, and then I got to edit my title, right? So this is not defects by manufacturing line anymore. This is production by manufacturing line. So now we can kind of see these are, you know, this point and this point are the same visual place. The scales are the same. The dates are kind of the same. You know, I get a sense, you know, we don't have a, you know, a legend down here that kind of takes up a little bit more of the space, but I can kind of visually look at this and know that these are the same, kind of the same bits of information on that. So that's, you know, we're 23 minutes into doing this, and we've already got, you know, a pretty decent, you know, cut on this dashboard. The next tile we want to work on is our defect resolution. And so what we're going to sort of expand on here is we're going to be able to use multiple Y values, right? So we have 3 defect resolutions that we track, you know, scrap, as is, and corrected. And so we can deal with that pretty easily in Transform here. So I'm going to make a new tile. I'm going to make it, oops, I'm going to make a new tile. A new blank chart. We'll make it large, medium. So the type we're going to use here is actually a percent bar. So this is going to stack and everything's going to add up to 100%. This is because we want to know the breakout of each resolution category as a part of the whole. And then our processing type, we're going to add up numeric values here, and we'll grab some things from each field. And then our X in this case is still going to be the date. we want it to look similar to our defect chart. So we'll go to our production report, we'll choose our date field. We're going to cluster that by day again. And I like my compact labels. Our Y, this is where we're going to make a change, is actually we're going to graph multiple fields here. So this lets me then add the ones I want. So the first one I'm going to choose from my form. I'm going to choose my scrap. And for display text, we'll add scrap. And then we're going to add in another one. We're going to take, again, from the form. Now we want as is. And then we're going to add one more. And we're going to get our corrected. And so what you can see here is now we have a stack bar for every date, for each category. So if I go over to my, my legends, let's do a title for the chart. Let's call this defect resolutions. We want to have a legend for this, right? And you can see that it's using what I typed in for my my display text here. So as we kind of look at this, the other thing that I think would be useful is to know what the data actually is. It's kind of hard to say, how many defects is this? And so we do have an option for data labels. And then there's a format, which is just the precision for numbers. So you can see that it's added those in, 43% of them on this date. That's a total of 62. So that gives me a pretty good view. And then the other thing, I want my color schemes to be a little consistent. And the other thing that's most important to me is scrap, right? So scrap is the defect we want the least of. And right here, it's hard to tell, right? It's blue. It doesn't stand out from the color scheme. So what I'm actually going to do is use a scheme that will highlight in red the scrap, and then maybe we'll make it a little less visible for the other two categories. So in this case, if I go to my color scheme here, so the colors are applied in the order that they were listed. So you can see now I can really see at a glance my scrap, right? And the other two categories I'm not as concerned with. So I can say, oh, well, this is, this is what I want. Let's move it around a little bit. So, now you can see my dashboard's kind of coming together. And what I really want to do is I want this one to start on a new row so that it's starting to look like kind of the picture that we had sketched out here. So that's, I don't know, Dave, if there are any questions or anything popping up yet, or I can take a quick pause as we move kind of on to the next one.
No, I think you can move on. There are no questions at the moment, but just as a reminder, if you do have questions, type them into the questions box of the GoToWebinar control panel.
Okay. So now we want to look at, and actually we go back, we kind of saved this space up here for some of those really key metrics, right? So we've got, our sort of weekly or by day, defects. We've got our production down here, and now we had some couple key metrics we wanted up here at the top. So the first one we want to look at is the defect rate by shift. So there's two new features we're going to show here. One is, well, three really. We're going to actually calculate our Y value because we don't have defect rate. we're going to filter at the tile level as in addition to the at the dashboard level. And we're going to change our X from date. This will be the first tile that we don't use a date for our X value. But I think it's useful to know that it doesn't always have to be a date. So I'm going to make a new tile, another blank chart. This one I actually, oops, I think I want, no, I want that, yeah, something like that. So my chart type here, let's just use a bar chart to start with, see if that looks okay. In this case, our processing type is actually going to be the average of numerics, right? So we're going to have defect percentages, you know, but we want for today. And we'll get fields from each form. Now, what I want to do for this is I don't want all of the production forms. I just want the ones from today. So I'm going to add a filter at the tile level. And we are going to look at the actual form fields here. And so I actually want the date is during a relative time period, and that relative period is going to be today. So I only want the forms for today. And so that's going to cut down the number of forms that we have. I can actually see what they are by turning on this intermediate data as I go through building this out. But so for our X, as we talked about, and we're going to use our production form again. We're going to have not use date, but we're actually going to use shift, because we want to know by each of the three shifts that we have, A, B, and C, what the values are. And for our Y, we don't know defect rate. And so what we're going to have to do, there's no field on the form that tells us what the defect rate is. So we're actually going to have to calculate that. And that calculation is relatively simple. We know that the only forms we're dealing with are the ones for today. So we just take the number of defects for today, divide it by the number of that we produced, and I round it off and then multiply by 100 to get to a nice percentage. So we can just copy that little bit of TPL, drop it in. That's the TPL for my Y value. And you can see now I have, a little bar graph. Let's give it a title. I don't think we need a legend just yet. So if we look at that, we can say, well, this kind of is hard to tell, like, what I'm really looking at, right? And so maybe what we want to do is make this a little bit more visual and say, my defect rates are small. So there's a thing, if we did a stack bar, we could sort of like give us a shading part for that's not a defect, right? So, instead of using a bar chart, we can make that a stack bar. Instead of doing this one for Y, we could say, we could have multiple data fields, and we can have a TPL expression for each one. So maybe that's that one, and then maybe we want the inverse, which is just, in this case, I'm going to say 10 minus that, right, to take up the rest of the space. And then the other thing that we can do is let's adjust the actual axes so that we're only really worried about that's maximum. These values are only ever going to be 2%, 4%. You know, in our logic, if it's higher than 5%, it's really bad. So we can restrict the range so that you know, it only shows, you know, shows big slices for each piece that we want. And then the last thing that we would do is, just to make it more visible, change our color scheme to gray out the unimportant part, right? So now we can see, and this is actually defect percentage, right? So maybe we give it a better title. And what I really am thinking about in my layout here is that this tile is going to represent my defect rate for the day. So as I start to think about it, you know, maybe it's a little bit bigger. Now my defect by shift. And then I want to also see defect rate by item number, but I can just use the same thing I just created here, right? We can just change the X from shift to item, which is a field we have. So what we're producing, and obviously we have to change our label, defect percentage by item, something like that. So now our dashboard's really kind of coming together here. You know, we've got our important metrics at the top. We've got some intermediate metrics in the middle. We've got some less important stuff at the bottom. At a glance, I can see what my scrap is, you know, what my defect totals are, and by what, you know, manufacturing line. I can see my shifts. I can see my products and see where the, you know, where the problems are. Shift B, you know, seems to have a trouble. I can go back and look. I can actually click on, you know, these segments and see the submission forms that make it up. Here's what they were producing. Here's, you know, they had 20 defects out of 200 they produced. That's pretty terrible. I can see when it was, who submitted it. You know, I can drill into that. What I like to sort of use as a theme for you know, analytics, or what transform analytics really needs to be, is you know, it's three pieces. It's really collecting data, analyzing that data, and then taking some action, acting. So this is kind of leading us there. So we got about 20 minutes left, which is good, because the last major thing we're going to do on this is, well, actually two things. One, I want to add some interactivity to the tiles. So, you know, defect by shift and defect, you know, by item. It'd be useful if we could see other time ranges other than today, right? We filtered it just to today's forms, but maybe I want to see yesterday or the whole month or something. So we can use user inputs to sort of add interactivity to it, and we're going to do that. As Dan had indicated, these user inputs could be at a tile or at the whole dashboard level, and they can drive filters and be used in some of your TPL and stuff. So in the dashboard level filters, you might have to refresh the data if you're using them as part of the filter. But so what we're going to do is we're going to update our defect rate to add a user input. So flip back over here. There's a user inputs tab. We can just create a new one. You know, we'll just call this date. And it's like, you know, it's or you know, time period. So what we want is a relative date here, and we're just going to use a button list. We could do adjustable periods, which give us that arrow to go forward and backward by the month. But in this case, there's a few things that I just want to be able to see. All of the data, just today, just yesterday, just this month or last month. That's what's interesting to me. I want it to default to today, so we'll do that. And so that adds, as you can see, the buttons up at the top. And then we have to adjust our filter now to where we're saying during a relative time period today. What we actually want here now is to take our user input, and we take time period to give us a very simple interactive filter. So now, it defaulted to today. This is today's. I can look at yesterday's as different. This month, cumulative, last month, for the all the data I have. So that's a real simple way. And of course, we could go add that to whatever tiles we wanted. But it lets me say, well, Shift B is doing this today. What did they look like yesterday? Oh, well, yesterday wasn't as bad, or last month they were kind of rough, but this month, something like that, right? So the last major one we're going to work on here is today's defect rate, the one in the upper hand left. So we're going to use a different tile type. We're actually going to use a text tile here, which just gives us a TPL template that we can put in to sort of produce some text or other results. We left the default number of forms tile on there because it's a good example of one. And as Dan kind of showed, we have access to this object dash, which has some properties in it, one of which is dash.rows, which is an array of all the forms for that tile. So you can also define your own TPL functions, either at the dashboard level or the temp or each tile, in order to use those. So what we want here for today's defect rate, the first thing we want to do is we need this tile to only show the forms from today. So we're going to go ahead and add that filter in here real quick. So we want production report. We want the date field on the production report to be during a relative time range. That relative time range is today. So there's 44 forms that have been submitted today, right? So that's a good start. What we really want to do is display the defect rate as a percentage and a color-coded gauge to give me a visual indication of where we're at. So if it's 2% or less, that's good. If it's 2 to 5%, then maybe that needs some attention. If it's more than 5, then that's really horrible. And so we want to kind of accommodate that. So what we need to do is calculate the defect rate, and we're going to use a little TPL function to do that. So we get all of the forms as dash.rows. So we're just going to loop through there, add up our production quantity and our defect totals, do a little bit of math, and return a rate. So in the tile, we have a TPL section here where we can dump some TPL functions. So I can just go grab my function defect rate. Just drop that in there. And then I just need to use my template to actually give me call my function here. Now I could have made that function at the dashboard level and have it pass in parameters. It would take the dash.rows or something, so I could use it in other tiles. But for this case, I'm just going to use it for this tile. So you can say today's defect rate is 5%, right? So now we're sort of getting a little closer. This kind of shows me the percentage, but it doesn't really give me the visual indicator that I was looking for. So as Dan showed yesterday, there's a TPL function available in the dashboard. It's called chart gauge that will generate a gauge based on some arguments, right? And it's, what value what's the label, what color, or what's the maximum range, things like that. So if we just throw this call into my template, I'm going to get a gauge that looks similar to this. In fact, I've got enough time. Let's just go ahead and do that. All right. So got my template. Maybe we want to center the gauge. Early brace to start some TPL. Close my curly brace, close my center tag, right? And, oh, what did we do? We forgot parentheses. There we go. Anyway, it gives me a pretty ugly gauge. And it gives me a really small slice, right? What I really need to do is change how I call that, but so we can make that better, right? So, you know, in this case, hey, I don't need to go to 100% because I know if it's, you know, if it's bigger than 5, that's bad. So I don't need to show like 0 to 5% on this, on a gauge to 100%. So I can change it to like 10. So if it's like, this is medium and anything over here is going to be bad. You know, so that gives us something like this. And so what I really want to do though, if I make it just red all the time, even if it's good, well, that's still going to stand out and like, well, why is it red? What I can do is I want to change the color at a glance, right? So, and here, as we talked about in the first session, you know, traffic light colors have cultural meaning. So, you know, we'll use green if it's good. We can use orange if it's, you know, needs some intervention, and red if it's bad. And so we can write a real quick little function that just, you know, we pass it in the rate, and if it's greater than 5, we'll make it red. If it's, you know, above 2, we'll make it orange, and if it's less than 2, we'll make it green, and we can pass that color back into our gauge. So I'll just grab that function real quick. We'll drop it into our tile. And this could be a function at the top level as well that we use. And then the last thing we want to do is just put it all together. And I'm just going to copy my template text here so I don't have it all screwed up. And now I have my gauge. And you can see today's defect rate is 5%. That would be orange. And so I know, hey, I need some intervention. I have a little label here, just percentage, to show that this is a percent, and things like that. One thing that we could do real quick just to show is I can go and say, well, instead of just greater than 5, maybe it's greater than or equal to 5, because we know it's 5 today. That'll change the color to red, right? You know, because it is 5. Now, if it went down, it would go orange, and then green if it was in the range we want. So with about 10 minutes left, now we have, you know, our production operation dashboard that tells us everything that we had talked about, you know, at the beginning. So most important for me is today's defect rate, and I can see it's highlighted for me. It's not good today. I did want to know by shift and by item, you know, what those look like, defect rates. I can see my defect resolution categories, and the important one to me is scrap. So like this, you know, this should be as low as I can. You know, I can see my defects by manufacturing line, and which I can look at which lines are the problematic ones. I can see my production. I can see my production by manufacturing line, you know, and it all fits on one screen. I could turn on the automatic refresh mode, and every 15 minutes this would update on a billboard or something. I could see that as well. I'm going to pause for a minute, Dave, and see if there are some questions. I might bounce over to the Slack here. I know it's been going off a little bit.
Yeah, so starting at the beginning, and you already demonstrated this, but it always seemed that when you started a new dashboard, up at the top left, there was this tile which said the number of records. And the question was, could you move that to another place or resize it or change it? But it looks like you already have changed it. But
Yeah, so you can resize it, you can delete it. So a dashboard always has to have at least one tile. So if you delete all the tiles off a dashboard, it will add that one back.
You just get that one default one until
you
you
get that
make
one
a different
default
one.
one back. If you added you get the default one, and then I built my production one, I could have deleted that tile. There's an option to delete the tile from the dashboard.
Yesterday, it seemed, maybe when Dan was showing it or the day before, when you clicked on a particular segment in a chart, it would actually show you the records that were used to calculate that segment. Can you show how that was set up? Or can you demonstrate that in action and show how that was set up?
Yeah, so it works by default for depending on the processing type, right? So in the case of defects by shift by today, for example, it is going to be, I filtered my forms to only the ones that are today. And then the segment on here automatically, says these are the ones that are shift B, the forms that they've submitted for that category, or it's a little bit difficult to show some variations on this because the different segments that I'm using here are all from the same form, right? But in the case of this would be only the forms from, let's say the 25th of September that make up that column.
Right.
And I don't have a column on my view that shows me, but each one of these is going to be a form with the 25th.
But those are the ones that made up that segment on that graph.
Those are the ones that make up.
So what's the setting to turn that hot link, I guess, for lack of a better term, on or off in a particular?
It's automatically on. I get that as part of creating the chart in Transform here.
That's fantastic. What if you want to
now on a text, like on a template tile, part of the properties is what to do when somebody clicks on the tile. Right, so in this case, it's going to show me the forms that make up today because I have a filter. But I could choose to show all of the forms for the whole dashboard, or don't do anything if I click on it. There is a TPL template action that lets you define what happens when you click on it. That's in the it's in the help, or the not so quick start guide does document it somewhere in here.
Wow. So you could do other things than just open up the chart?
So and essentially it all works with the idea that if I look at, this tile, I have, the data that I've collected. And then once it's processed, it tells me which form is made up this XY combination, right?
Yeah.
Or group combination, basically, right? So this is grouped into two groups, the defect percentage and then 10 minus the defect percentage, right? So this tells me, in this case, they're the same, right? It's the same forms make that up because it's the same data. But this tells me where it's going to show me when I click on it. And you do have, and I can show this, I did prepare to do this. We can do post-processing to sort of manipulate that data. So as an example that I put on mine, if we go in here to this one, and we can I'll get this out of the way for a minute. We want to do some post-processing on this. So what I get is the data, from this part. And I get to, like this. I get to manipulate this into post-processed data. And so what I can do is, I'm just going to copy this over I can loop through all the rows, and I'm just going to set a property called tip for each row, and I'm just going to set it to the value of the Y for that row. And when I do that, you can see that I get a tip that is the Y, and what that actually is now if that's a hover over the point, it's going to tell me what the total actually is, for example.
That's cool. Yeah.
So one of the other things that you have that you can do in that is you actually can manipulate which forms are associated with that segment. If you had some other set that you wanted to show. You also have the ability to generate a lot of this data just with TPL, in which case, at various points you have, pre-processing that you can manipulate, post-processing. You can actually create all your chart data with just TPL. So you can specify this through your code to make it do whatever you show whichever forms you want. When you do that. So.
Very cool. Someone mentioned that they kind of like the whole look of Transform. They're wondering if this could be an Alpha Anywhere theme, the styling, and it isn't currently, but there's no reason why we couldn't. We could take a look at what we have done to make the changes to probably the Alpha theme, is what we built this on. And so just send an email to guides@alphasoftware.com if that's the sort of thing you'd be interested in getting. The other thing is, okay, we got a few of those. Oh yeah, when it comes to getting stuff to line up on the screen, at the very beginning when you were putting it together, now I don't have OCD, but it was bothering me. So, but it appears that you can make everything look nicely on the screen. It's just a matter of adjusting the heights and the widths in order to get it.
Yeah, I mean, so.
And then they will line up.
Yeah, in this case, you want to think about a couple of things. You have sort of canned widths, right? And they're fractions of each other, so they should, line up. I think the extra large one is, might give some people pause, but because I think it's this extra large might be the same as two mediums or something like that. Yeah, and then the heights, obviously, you want to try to line those up as well. I really look at it when I was laying this out is, these graphs needed more vertical space, right? And they needed more horizontal space. What I would probably do in a real production instance is add a time filter here that would let me show this week, last week, next week, right? So there'd be 7 columns. It just, because I only created data for the last 2 weeks or whatever, then it fits on here. But if this was like ongoing, eventually the graph will start to look, I can make it look really terrible, right? By trying to jam it into a small width or
exactly,
or medium, right? So, and then extra large would give you even more space. So those are some of the things that you have to think about when you're laying it out. Like I said, it's the important things on top. Generally, that's a small. I really only made this size so it would fill the space I had. It actually, from a tile perspective, as a small, actually looks okay, right? But then the problem is I have space to fill.
Right.
So I made it bigger, right? Just
it.
visually kind of make it fit in a little better.
Yeah, nice. Cool. Well, we have hit the end of our time, although we did have a few questions we didn't get to. So if you could send those questions into guides, GUIDES @alphasoftware.com, we would be very happy to answer them. Greg, thank you very much. Yep.
Dan and I have a breakout session tomorrow afternoon, I believe.
Yes.
To talk about Transform. So you can ask your questions there as well.
The other thing I would like to point out, Alpha Anywhere users, we are offering a 1-user, no charge license to Transform. So you can use it for your own use. You can use it for commercial use as you wish. It is 1 user, but there's a bunch of fun things that you can do with it. If you didn't get our emailing about that offer, just send an email to guides, GUIDES @alphasoftware.com. and then give us a few days because we'll probably get a lot of requests and we can get you out licenses for that. But because I think that once you start playing with Alpha Transform, you realize how amazingly cool it is and how it can really work nicely together with Alpha Anywhere. Anyway, thank you very much, everyone, for attending. Our next session is back into the world of Alpha Anywhere. We'll be dealing with APIs and doing CRUD operations. That's with Nikos, showing you how to figure out how your APIs, or I guess we should call them web services, that you get from third parties work and how to connect them to list controls. So I think you're going to find that to be a very useful session. That's coming up at 10:30, about 29 minutes from now. See you then. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.